afternoon. For those of you who have come from across grounds and don't know me, I'm Risa Goluboff. I'm the Dean of the Law School here, and it is a privilege to welcome you all. And I would say, I think you all know this, but our students are in exams, so I think the audience is small but fiercely committed, I'm sure. And I would just like to say that I spend a lot of time not attending panels because there are things that I have to do that are not at the panel, and I can't tell you how sad I am that I cannot stay for this entire panel. This is a panel that is both full of luminaries and talking about really important things. And I would say, just from my personal perspective, things I personally care deeply about and my own scholarship is about. So I'm sorry I won't get to be here, but I'm really glad that you will. So let me just say, Chris Berk, Bernard Harcourt, Vesla Weaver, and Heather Thompson, you could not have a better group of people to talk to you about mass incarceration, the carceral state, prison resistance, from the nuts and bolts to the political science, to the philosophy, to the history. They cover the landscape in ways that are sophisticated, really smart, really topical, and present, and you are just lucky to hear from them. So I will watch the video when it comes out, and I will listen to it when I have the opportunity, but let me just say it is a privilege and a pleasure to have all of you here and to hear what you have to say. So thank you for being here. Thank you, Chris, for organizing, and Debbie Hellman for helping organize, and it is really our privilege. So thank you.
Well, I'll echo that welcome. My name is Chris Berk. I'm a postdoc here at the University of Virginia. I want to echo that thanks that was just given to Debbie Hellman and the University of Virginia School of Law, support from the Department of Politics, as well as the program in political philosophy, policy, and law. Without these folks, this would not have happened. I'm so excited to have this event here today. Just by way of a brief roadmap for our session this evening, after a brief introduction, I'm going to moderate an exchange among our panelists. We're going to leave about 45 minutes for a more structured discussion among the panelists, and then open up the latter part of the session for audience questions. They're very excited to hear what you have to say, as am I. And for those that would like to meet Professor Harcourt, Professor Weaver, Professor Thompson, we'll leave time at the end for you to come up and talk to them. So I want to start with a simple observation. Description and policy prescription are often bound together. How one describes a situation brings particular features into relief and casts other features in shadow. And in the process, it makes particular responses more or less plausible. It's hard to imagine a more fitting example of this than prison reform. Some focus on the scale of imprisonment and the sheer enormity of the U.S. carceral state. Last year, there were about 1.5 million people in federal and state prisons, not including those in municipal and county jails, immigrant detention, along with outpatient forms of custody, like probation and parole. And in this narrative, where our attention is turned to wider, more macro forces. Others find the emphasis on a single national level story less helpful. A national story, they argue, is too blunt of an instrument to convey the complexity of the problem and its history. A state-level story about, say, the specific circumstances of Virginia is an improvement. However, here, too, this misses a lot of detail. Ideally, perhaps we would tell 3,144 stories, one for each county in the United States. Whatever one's preferred level of analysis, the effects of criminal justice policy are not randomly distributed by class, gender, race, disability, or even geography. Particular communities and particular sorts of people have borne the brunt of what we now refer to as mass incarceration. Young black men without a college degree face a staggering risk of being imprisoned at some point in their life, 1 in 3. Similarly, those with mental illnesses constitute a large segment of the prison population and overrepresented in both the use of force and imposition of solitary confinement within prison walls. There is a long, venerable line of social scientific analysis that has carefully tracked these differential effects in detail. And how one thinks about the effects of criminal justice, too, can influence the discussion. Scholars have turned our attention to the so-called collateral consequences of custody. When someone is removed from the community, it's not just a lawbreaker that's removed, but a spouse, a friend, a lover, a parent, a worker, a taxpayer, a voter, a community member, and so on. And in these roles, consequences ramify, often with intergenerational consequences. On a different register, how we envision the place of prisons in social life seems to also to matter. Prisons are often described as spaces set apart from civil society. We talk about life on the inside, individuals who are cut off from society, being locked in, being let out, prisoner reentry and prisoner return. This implicit mental mapping subtly shapes evaluative judgments across a number of domains, from economics to law. And just quickly, two stark examples of this. Assessments of the economic gains of African Americans since the 1980s are cast in an entirely different light when statistics are adjusted to include the mass incarceration of young black men over that same period. Those gains, in short, are almost entirely wiped out. Similarly, a shift in perspective calls into question gains in public safety. We've experienced what some have called a great American crime decline, but violence within custodial institutions isn't featured in local, state, or federal crime statistics. And what information we do have about these places offers a hellish portrait. When we view prisons as continuous with and not separate from wider political struggles, our attention is directed to disenfranchisement laws, prisoners' rights struggles, inmate work stoppages, and mass strikes, and we're forced to ask philosophical questions about the place of custody in the democratic polity. In sum, and taking a step back, not only is the terrain in front of us complex, but we have a variety of maps, only a few of which I've just gestured towards, and it's less clear which, if any, should be our guide. It's hard to imagine a more impressive group of scholars to help sort us through these issues that surround both rebellion and reform in our historical moment. Each of these panelists are at the top of their respective fields. They are also prominent public intellectuals and activists. I'm going to give a brief introduction for each panelist and then turn to the discussion. Vesla Weaver is a Bloomberg Distinguished Associate Professor of Political Science and Sociology at Johns Hopkins. Prior to joining the faculty at Hopkins, she was a tenured professor at Yale University, and prior to that, faculty here at the University of Virginia. In that time, she's authored a number of important articles and books, including an award-winning book with Amy Lerman, Arresting Citizenship: The Democratic Consequences of American Crime Control, the first large-scale empirical study of what large-scale shifts in incarceration and policing have meant for political and civic life in communities where it was concentrated. Bernard Harcourt is a contemporary critical theorist, advocate, and author of a number of award-winning books, most recently, The Counter-Revolution: How Our Government Went to War Against Its Own Citizens. He is the Isidore and Seville Schulbacher Professor of Law and Professor of Political Science at Columbia University. Harcourt, among other appointments, is the executive director of the Eric Holder Initiative for Civil and Political Rights and the founding director of the Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought. Heather Ann Thompson is a historian at the University of Michigan and is the Pulitzer Prize and Bancroft-winning author of Blood in the Water, the Attica Prison Uprising of 1971 and its legacy. She also wrote the book Who's Detroit? Politics, Labor, and Race in a Modern American City in 2001, which was republished in 2017 on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Detroit riot in 1967. I'm going to begin by asking the panelists to take about 5 to 10 minutes to put the contemporary concerns over prison reform in the context of their own recent work. And here I'm going to ask Heather to talk about her work in particular and start off the conversation.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for coming. And what I know is a not great time of year to be coming and listening to other people talk, but I really appreciate that you're here, and thank you, Chris, for bringing us all together. We've had a tremendously enriching day already, getting to talk with Chris about his manuscript. And so that's both a pro for us, but it's also maybe a con for you, because I think our gray cells might be a little bit fried. I've tried to get some of my thoughts down here in note form, which I might just read so that I don't completely veer off. But I hope that we can pick up on some of these things in discussion. So Chris asked us to reflect on this, the issue of prison reform, but to do so through the lens of our own work. And so I think what I want to do is first locate my work and to think about the questions that he's asking us. I want to locate myself in the conversation by beginning to say that look, there's enormous efforts that are being put right now into rethinking the carceral state, the one that Chris just described, for all kinds of really important reasons. But I do think that we come to this wearing many different hats, and I want to share with you what those hats are. So I am a historian by training. I work mostly on policing and prisons. The first book on Detroit was really about police brutality and black politics. The second book on Attica was the prison book. But I'm also someone who, for the last decade, has done a lot of work on prisons as sort of institutions to think about the policy question of what do we do about prisons. So I wrote an article called Why Mass Incarceration Matters. That was what really connected me to the policy discussions on prisons and the prison reform discussions. So through that, I had the honor to sit on a National Academy of Sciences panel to talk. We met for 2 years to talk about the causes and consequences of high rates of incarceration. It was 2 very intense years. But through that, I was also able to spend a lot of time talking to, but also listening to I give congressional staff briefings, also got to talk to prosecutors in the nation's 35 largest districts about what it is that they thought they were doing with policing in prisons. I got to participate in the very historic 2012 summit in Washington, D.C. called the Bipartisan Summit of Criminal Justice Reform, which was, I will just say, a surreal moment where in the same room we had the ACLU, the Koch brothers, the Christian evangelical. I mean, it was a bizarre moment, but it was a moment nevertheless where everyone agreed on one premise, which was that this was a disaster that needed undoing. And that was in 2012. And since then, it isn't that criminal justice reform impulse has died away. It has, I think it's largely transferred itself from that policy level in DC for obvious reasons to the ground floor where it's probably most powerful to begin with, which is the grassroots movement for criminal justice reform and also the state level legislative moment for criminal justice reform. So where I fit into this is sort of strangely because I'm very interested in the question, but as a historian, I'm also deeply skeptical of a lot of the discussions that are being had. And so I wanted to share a little bit with you about that. The last thing I want to say about the hat I wear is I also, just in my work, but also in the policy, political work, to me, it has been just essential to elevate, to center the voices of people who have been impacted by the system that we're trying to undo. And so what that means for me is to try to shine the light on what actually is going on inside via pieces for the New York Times or Rolling Stone or CNN or whatever, but it also means at the grassroots level, kind of thinking hard about what my position is on a given proposal, not knowing what that position is until I've actually had some time to sit down and think about how it would play out from the perspective of people who are most directly impacted by it. So what does that have to do with prison rebellion? Well, I think that we were asked to think about prison rebellion and prison reform today. And the truth is that those are often posited as prison rebellion versus prison reform, right? This idea that that we should either rebel against internally and externally and overthrow the system, or we should reform it. So actually, this question of prison rebellion and prison reform is a question at its real core, or it has been posed that way, about prison abolition versus prison reform. And I think we're really there right now as a movement. There's huge groups that are really committed to this project of prison abolition, to getting rid of this apparatus as we know it, and then others who are committed to reforming it much more immediately. So putting energies into things like the Clean Slate Act or the Second Chance Act. Well, I can't really come at those questions in any other way than a historian. So again, to locate myself, I'm someone who spent the last 13 years of my life rescuing and chronicling the extraordinarily complicated story behind one of the country's most dramatic prison uprising, and that was one that took place at Attica in 1971. And, so that gave me a lot of a window on what does a prison rebellion really look like, and how might it connect with these contemporary issues such as beating back mandatory minimums or reducing the age that juveniles can be confined as adults, or these kind of more practical, immediate demands. Well, I have a lot of thoughts on this, but let me just pose a few before I turn it over. One of the things that working really closely on prison rebellions has shown me, and I think specifically has bearing on this question of prison reform, is that whether we're looking at Attica, which I know inside and out, or whether we're looking at other prison uprisings from ones in the 60s, such as Cummins Farm in Arkansas, or years later in 1980, the New Mexico prison uprising, or much more recent prison strikes and uprisings across the nation in 2016 and 2018, The one thing that you can't help but notice about every single one of these incidents is that the actions precede first a intense period where the folks inside have been mobilizing in various capacities, various political capacities, have a lot of different political points of view, but the one thing that they agree about fundamentally is that this institution has denied them basic humanity, and that the most important platform on which everyone can agree is to demand things that will help, that will recognize them as human beings. So these are often very quite simple demands. Basic medical care, the ability to read what you want to read in prison. And that really is true, whether it's Attica or today I'm in a major lawsuit against the Department of Corrections in Illinois and about ready to file one in New York because people can't read my book inside. So these are kind of basic human rights. Now, that is not to minimize, I want to be really clear, that is not to minimize the deeper political thought that is going on in prisons. At Attica, there were Black Panthers, there were Young Lords Party members, there was intensely rich political discussions going on about how to improve the nation, the world, and the prison that were beyond these basic demands. But the basic demands to be treated as human were galvanizing, they were energizing, and they were the one thing that people agreed upon across multiple communities inside of the yard. So, for example, at Attica, some of you, if you know anything about Attica, one of a very key voice at Attica was a guy named Elliot Barkley. And if you don't know his name, you probably know his vision, which was he was this tall, skinny kid with these granny glasses, and he had the famous speech, which said, "We are men, we are not beasts, we refuse to be beaten and driven as such." And that was such a powerful summing up of what the totality of the Attica demands represented. Now, I'm calling attention to this for a reason, which is that at that time in Attica, and I would venture to say even in the prison strikes of recent years and recent events, for example, that I've covered at Lee Correctional Facility in South Carolina, nobody in those key moments of upheaval were questioning the basic premises of the system, which was confinement, ironically. And I wished it was differently. I wanted to find it to be differently. But it wasn't. What was being questioned was not the right of the state to adjudicate justice at some fundamental level. What was at stake was the bounds of how it was done. It was the fact that it was deeply racialized, it was deeply classed, and therefore it was deeply unjust. And that the basic human rights demands were paramount because it was the only thing, that was what's most at question. So even in the recent prison strikes, and I know I'm going on, but the recent prison strikes, there's an enormous activism that goes on, but the fundamental request to not be exploited and treated as slaves is itself not challenging in fundamental ways the prison itself. Now that matters, not because, by the way, people inside are not questioning those things. I'm just talking about the form that the rebellion takes. So I think that this actually poses a really interesting conundrum for us today as we navigate these waters between prison reform and prison abolition. The very existence of prison uprisings, the very expression of prisoner voice and determination is something that we on the outside, if you hope to change that system fundamentally as I do, those episodes of prison uprising are deeply heartening because they suggest that the system is not legitimate, that the voices from inside will help to topple that system from the inside. And yet there's a deep irony because when those prison uprisings are successful, what they are successful in doing is reforming the system. They are successful in making that system more humane, which in turn is doing the exact opposite work of actually trying to dismantle that system. And so there is this real tension between celebrating the overthrow of the entire system via prisoner activism and the recognition that the very activism, because it is framed in this humanitarian way, again, when responded to, tends to legitimize the system. So, for example, right now we have a situation where we have certain key legislative initiatives right now, whether it's the Clean Slate Act or Second Chance Act. And many people publicly in the prison abolition community, those of us who feel very strongly that the system cannot be reformed, it is inherently racist, it is inherently a system of control and racial dominance, that those kinds of acts are hard to support because in some respects they suggest the legitimacy of the system and they suggest that they can be reformed, they just need to be made more humane. So my closing thought on that is that is a conundrum, but how I've navigated it, because Chris asked us to kind of place ourselves in this at some level, is that I take you back to what I said in the beginning about working most closely by elevating the voices of folks inside and doing more listening than talking in those spaces, which is, it is a conundrum, but for the communities and even, I think many of my own family is impacted by this, I will just reveal, but for any impacted community, prison reform is revolutionary in itself. Because even to ask for those basic humanitarian things, such as a second chance at inclusion in the polity, or the ability to not be exploited as enslaved labor in the prison, or the ability to have medical care. Even those acts themselves, I think, are revolutionary and radical in a way that we don't appreciate, and that if we actually take seriously how devastating the experience of incarceration is, that to support those actually do not necessarily reinforce the system. And that the other lesson to be drawn of a place like Attica is that while it is true that that what might deem a success of a prison rebellion is to bring some reforms, like, for example, better visitation follows the Attica rebellion, it is also true that the very spirit of that activism on a basic humanitarian basis generates all kinds of new imaginations and possibilities about what justice could look like in America. So I don't think that they're actually oppositional, and I think that it is perfectly okay to support those prison reform impulses for all of the reasons that I just laid out, but not to do so grudgingly or even as a, I guess we have to because we don't have anything else, but actually to understand those moments of victory as empowering themselves and politically generated themselves. And I could say more about that, but that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Heather. Vesla?
So thank you for inviting us to speak today and for having the vision for this event, and to Dean Goluboff for having us here. I'm not going to talk about my past work, but when I thought of what needs saying today, I think I want to shift from thinking about prison reform towards policing. Mm-hmm. All of us have served on, multiple manifestations of prison reform bodies. And most of the progressive reform efforts are focused on the tail end of criminal justice, which is confinement, sentencing, conditions. But look to the front end: police predation, misdemeanor justice, encounters that occur long before any formal conviction is obtained. And what you see is the disappearance of conservatives from the coalition. Mm-hmm. The conversation quickly becomes about modifying technology, improvements in technology, body cameras and the like, and away from people and investing in the social roots of crime. But the front end, I would argue, is even more important, not only because it creates the sample for the back end, but precisely because it contains a lot more possibility for discretion, a lot more innocence, and I use that in scare quotes, and a lot more kids. And so I'm going to talk about those 3 things. But also because of those 3 features, reform, I would argue, is even more plausible, potentially impactful, and more disruptive to the bad feedbacks that we've witnessed. So I've been at work at something called the Portals Policing Project. We have a new website, so it's portalspolicingproject.com. I'm only going to speak about it for 2 sentences. But we dropped gold spray painting shipping containers in 11 neighborhoods in 6 cities in the United States, some of the most highly surveilled and incarcerated neighborhoods in this country, including one that is located in the 53206 zip code of Milwaukee, which is the highest incarcerated neighborhood in the entire nation. And these gold shipping containers contained immersive audiovisual technology in them. And we invited people to come in and bear witness to each other, collaborate with one another, exchange stories in this new civic infrastructure. The reason I mention this is that we are collecting the largest archive that I know of policing in our time, in our moment, by the policed themselves, giving voice to their experiences, to their freedom dreams, to their discursive frames, to their ideas for justice. And so I wanted to read to you, I'm going to read 2, maybe 3 conversational excerpts, only 2 of which are from this Portals Policing Project. And I'll tell you what the second of which is from in a moment. The first time the police stopped me, I was 11 years old, and they stopped me because I was playing water balloon fights with my friends during the summer. And they handcuffed all of us. They paraded us in front of the community. They had the helicopter on us, and this was like a group of 11-year-olds. Like nobody was older than 13. And like they had guns on us, like they pointed a gun to my head and they threatened our lives. That was a man in Baltimore. The second narrative is not part of the Portals Project. Bear with me. I was 11 years old, and I will never forget it. I used to go back and forth to church on Sunday afternoons to the United Methodist Youth Group, and I always rode the bus. And you had to stand on the corner, which was about 2 blocks from my house, to catch the bus. And the policemen, in those days, all police people were white. And these policemen would harass me as I was standing on this corner waiting for the bus to come. And sometimes the 2 of them would drive up, you know. The bus stop was up high and the street was down low, and they would drive up under there, and then they'd expose themselves. And the interviewer says, "Who, the policeman?" Yes, while I was standing there, and it just really scared me to death. And the only reason I did not go home at that time was because if I had gone home, my mother would have made me stay. So I just stepped back from the corner, and because I rode that way all the time, the bus driver didn't see me standing there at the corner. He'd always stop and I'd get on the bus. But it was these same cops, so I had a morbid fear of policemen all my life, and it has not completely gone away. And this was in the broad open daylight with the sun shining, but I will never forget it, and it always comes back to me every time I get into a really tight experience. That was really bad, and it was bad for all Black girls, you know. And her husband says that's one of the things that parents passed on to their children, fear and hate of the police. If you look at the Black kids today, even little ones, they are scared to death of policemen, and it's beginning to let up a little bit. The police are trying to erase that, but it's generations and generations and generations of fear. It was really hard for me to tell my children that these police were helping people. It was really hard, and I really prayed a lot over that. And I said, well, this is something that you got to do. I had a job as a public health nurse at Topeka, Kansas, and we had a lot of child abuse even then, and that was in the 50s. And my supervisor said to me, she gave me a situation. She said, now, when you go to a house and a man is beating his wife, now what are you going to do? I said, call the minister. And she said, Ferdy, you're an intelligent person. You know that's not right. I told her, she's a wonderful person. I said, Alice Jensen, I know that's not the right answer. I should call the police, but I don't believe in the police. And that was after my 3rd child was born. So it has taken a long time for me to have any kind of trust in the policemen as a group, even when I tried to say to myself, it's one person and everybody is not like everybody else. But it's really very difficult for me. And that has stayed with me. And then the third, now that was from a collection of oral histories that some smart group of researchers decided to collect in the aftermath of Jim Crow. They went and they interviewed thousands of people who had lived through Jim Crow to tell about their experiences. And we can have a conversation about this because the police are everywhere in those narratives. And yet, we have forgotten that. We have forgotten that for Malcolm X, Kelly Miller, Du Bois, George Jackson, police were central figures in theorizations of racial order and democracy in this country. The third transcript happened in Baltimore through the Sportos Project. And before that, I mean, even I can remember when we couldn't go on Johns Hopkins University on their campus as Black kids. We couldn't go on that campus because the caretakers would run us down. And if they couldn't catch you, most of the time they couldn't, but if they ever caught you, they slapped you around. They called the policeman. They tell a big damn lie on you and take you home. Then you get another ass whooping from your folks. Well, in this state, Johns Hopkins is a big institution. Not only the hospital, but all the campuses. And he goes on to say, you know, things have changed to a degree. Sometimes when I walk through the campus, I see young Black students and I smile at them. I used to say, well, how you doing? And you know, I was just glad to see them there, not just on the campus, but actually as students. But see, a lot of them are so young that they don't realize, you know, how far we've come for them to be doing that. They can't even fathom not being able to come on the campus grounds. I raise these transcripts to point out, to shine the light on two features of our system. Features that I think we need to turn the microphone up on, features that have been elided in conversations of justice reform, but that I think are central. The first feature, I hope you heard, children. That policing, though in the many conversations I have had on roundtables like this one, no one ever says policing is a childhood intervention. It is a policy of childhood. What we began to find, and what other empiricists have found, is that the average age of those who are stopped by police, of those who have an encounter or exposed to police, regardless of how minor that encounter is, regardless of whether that encounter leads to a formal adjudication or even a formal arrest. The majority of people who have an encounter with police have their first encounter at the tender age of 12 or 13. I can tell you, probably Heather will verify this, in the many discussions I have had about reform of the criminal justice system, police are not seen as a matter of childhood. That's right. If you look at the NYPD cases of stops, which is, you know, one of the few departments where we can actually track this, I was looking at the data the other day and realized that there were more stops by the NYPD between 2006 and 2016 of minors than of 18 to 30-year-olds. That stopped me in my tracks. What does that mean? Not always 17-year-olds, I'm talking about 13, 14, 15-year-olds. The work of Phil Goff has shown that police literally do not see these kids as kids, literally sees prepubescent youth as being fully matured. The result of these encounters, I would argue, are not momentary blips. They're not, you know, I stopped you, I asked what you're doing here, you showed me your ID, or you know, and I moved on. They are moments of profound political learning. They are moments where people learn to kiss the pavement. They are moments where they learn how the state regards and treats them. They are moments of learning anti-citizenship. Many empiricists have found that these moments of youth who were stopped by police, they exhibited the symptoms of PTSD. Your colleague, Jeff Fagan, the policing scholar, has found that police stops in a high-impact zone among the children, and he does all these nice randomization ways of showing that as this policy was unveiled across space, the test scores and reading scores of youth exposed to saturation policing went down and took fully a year to recover. Others have shown, and we're in a law school, that this ignites profound legal socialization at a tender age. These are impressionable moments. These are moments before youth have gotten a driver's license, before they've gone to vote for the first time, before they've submitted their first IRS tax reform. And so one of the things that I've been advocating for, it's become my hobby horse of late, is that once you recognize that policing is a childhood intervention, it is a policy of childhood, then we can begin to move towards a radical proposition, which is this. What would happen if instead of making youth contact with police their first animating, memorable experience of the state, what if instead we treated it as a very last resort and instead decided that youth should be approached by civic incorporating institutional attachments? That instead of learning to spread eagle up against a cop car or kiss the pavement, instead of hearing the racial invectives that are used, instead of having their bodies be sexualized by a police pat-down, which is what Paul Butler argues occurs, that these are actually moments of sexual power and abuse. What if instead we thought of these folks, these youth, as the next generation of civic agents, as leaders, as not realized democratic agents, as people for whom their first encounter with the state or with an authority should not be in this kind of confrontation? So that's the first thing. And then the second argument I want to make is something else that stopped me in my tracks. Imagine a 2x2 where on the first axis you have contact with the criminal justice system, yes or no. And on the second axis you have conduct, you have criminal offending, yes or no. Well, I'm an empiricist, and we looked back at a longitudinal survey of youth that was done on either side of the expansion of broken windows policing, on either side of the expansion of mass incarceration, of when the prison boom began in earnest. And what we found was very disheartening. On that 2x2, you would want most Americans to fall in the diagonal. Yes, I've had contact. Yes, I have run afoul of the law. Or conversely, no, I've had no contact. I've never been arrested. I've never been stopped by police. And no, I have not broken a law. I haven't engaged in criminal offending. Well, that's exactly where our system, where the majority of Americans were situated when youth were coming of age in 1979. We can show that empirically. In fact, it's quite amazing to me that actually precious few people had contact that had engaged in 6 criminal offenses. Under-enforcement was really the guiding principle. That's exactly where our criminal justice system fell. By 1997, the quadrants have shifted. The majority of Americans are in the off diagonal. Yes, I've committed a crime. No, I haven't had contact. No, I haven't committed a crime. And yes, I've been arrested. A sharp generational shift. It took one generation to happen. It was the explicit and anticipated consequences of explicit policy decisions to focus on low-level, minor, or even non-offenders. It was the explicit decision to target policing on certain neighborhoods, those that endured the lead-filled water, the bad schools, the interpersonal violence. And if I were to ask you what racial demographic groups fell in which quadrants, you can probably guess. Whites moved into the, no, I haven't had contact with criminal justice. I've never been arrested. But yes, I have driven a stolen car. I have driven drunk. I've engaged in fights. I've stolen. I've done drugs. I've sold drugs. And blacks fell in the opposite quadrant. Now, I think there's been a ton of attention to the rise in mass incarceration. There's been a ton of attention on sentencing reform. But until we reckon with that basic shift, that we have people occupying quadrants that make for an illegitimate criminal justice system, I don't think that we can grapple with what Khalil Muhammad calls the ideology of black criminality. For a reform effort to be truly successful, what needs to happen is we need to realign, we need to recouple criminal offending with criminal justice contact. That loosening over time, that misalignment is what creates the excesses of our system. There are many other excesses of the system, but that fundamental thing I've never heard a reformer reflect on. And that's what I think kids and realigning, recoupling contact with conduct in the quiet of the night, those two things are where I think we need to shine the light. And until we grapple with that, we will be tinkering around the edges.
Thanks, Vesla.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so I've got some prepared thoughts, but I need to follow up on what Vesla just said, because it's fascinating and raises really difficult issues. On the second point, let me just say three things. I'm just coming right off of what you just said. On the second point, you were saying realigning contact with conduct, okay? And by the way, I embrace everything you said. I mean, that was really very moving. I wouldn't, though, want to reify a notion of conduct, okay? So I think we need to be very careful in that project not to reify the notions of crime that we use, because those notions of crime are entirely constructed and are at the very basis of the problems that we are experiencing. In other words, it's not a mistake that we criminalize street conducts that are public in nature, that tend to be associated with poverty, and simply don't think about all of the other crimes that are taking place, right here, right around us, etc. And so somehow we're going to have to ambiguate the notion of contact, because there's a lot of theft that's taking place right in this building that we don't criminalize or we don't see. And we are committing a lot of things that could be criminalized, right? So that's one thing. second, I really appreciate, and I think it's really important to focus back on these policing questions, because it's clear, without question, that the move towards broken windows policing or aggressive misdemeanor arrests in the early 1990s was a form of governing. And that's exactly what you were saying, right? It was a form of governing. It was a way of governing populations and creating a particular kind of social order, particularly in a city like New York, where broken windows was kind of experimented with Bratton and Giuliani in '94, starting in '94. And that tie becomes really important because it's when you understand these practices as a form of governing that we can then tie them, I think, to mass incarceration and the prison, and it's that way that we can relate these conversations so seamlessly. And one of the transformations that I think is most important in that context is the way in which we've gone from, and we've continued with, so this form of governing, which was broken windows, which converted as a result of pressure on broken windows into stop and frisk, which then converted, because of pressure on stop and frisk and de Blasio's election, back into broken windows, bringing back Bratton, actually, for his second turn. All of those forms of governing have to also be related to feed into, of course, governing through incarceration. And then I would say also feed into now governing through a counterinsurgency warfare paradigm that targets, in part, different populations by creating internal enemies. The logics of the logic of broken windows policing also had a notion of an internal enemy, which was the notion of the disorderly, which of course was racialized, but it was a category that consisted of disorderly persons who were considered to be disorderly, aggressive panhandlers, homeless persons, drug dealing, commercial sex, etc. But which was racialized, but that was an internal enemy. Now, that internal enemy has continued, as evidenced by all of your portal narratives that are just so upsetting. That has continued, but at the same time, there are other internal enemies that have emerged more directly as a result of 9/11, which is Muslims in America as a category of an internal enemy that then becomes the focus of a particular kind of way of governing. The only third thing I wanted to say was one of the places in which this policing issue is so much with us right now that we all need to be really focusing on is policing the university, policing at the university, on the university campus. And so right now we're in a moment of kind of crisis of policing the university, policing our campuses. You've got a month-long protest going on at Johns Hopkins University that everybody should be following and supporting. They've taken over the administration building. They've been doing this for about 4 weeks now, challenging the fact that Johns Hopkins is going to hire a private police force, which it hasn't ever had before. You know, of course, of the incident at Yale, where one of the Yale's public safety officers shot a African-American woman. And of course, you probably know about what happened at Columbia or at Barnard recently, which is also, but it's kind of like, it is an issue that I think we all need to face, and that comes up directly in relationship to these policing stories. Now, so I did want to just kind of connect because those thoughts were, but then let me just briefly respond to the prompt, which asks us to explore how our work has evolved as a result of these issues. And so I'll just quickly talk about three different dimensions. One of them is the empirical, theoretical work. The second is litigation, and the third is my militancy. So now, by way of background, I think it's important to realize that we are at a particularly remarkable juncture for the prison, for mass incarceration, and for punishment in this country. I think that there is a wider consensus that we've had a disproportionate overcriminalization, mass incarceration, racialized mass incarceration in this country, which is somewhat remarkable that it's actually become something that many people feel needs to be addressed. I mean, when you start having, Jared Kushner and other people trying to address this issue, that means that, it's not just us anymore, right? So there is a sense that this is a problem, and lots of different initiatives, but very little progress, which is surprising. The numbers for 2017 just came out, right? We talk about all-time lows. It's 1.48 million in state prisons, okay, in prison populations, down from 1.61 in 2009. So the rate used to be 444 per 100,000 in 2009. Now it's 440 in 2017, okay? 444 to 440. 444 to 440. Now, that's 4,000 persons for every 100,000, which is a hell of a lot of human beings, right? But it's not, nothing is happening, really, right?
60% of it was in California.
Right. So some states have seen like 30% declines over the past 20 years. Alaska, Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, and Vermont. So there's some states where there are large declines, but overall, we're where we were before. We're still around 2.3 million when you add the jail populations, right? So it's just not moving. This iceberg is not moving. And what's also remarkable about these times is that prison hunger strikes and riots are pervasive, right? We've had national strikes, prison strikes, in the 2016. We've had a flurry of hunger strikes in prisons. We just had one in Alabama, where we had 8 prisoners who were on a hunger strike in March. They ended their hunger strike when the water taps were turned off. We've had the riots that Heather has written about and been working on in Lee Correctional Institution in South Carolina. We've had riots. We've had hunger strikes in Jackson County, Alabama. There's a ton of ongoing rioting and hunger strikes now as we speak at this moment, which reflects, I think, some kind of a breakdown or accentuation of of prison conditions. Of course, you're all familiar with the Department of Justice report that just came out on the Alabama statewide prison systems and all the attention that that's getting. But I think that somehow these hunger strikes at these moments, which they're not new, of course, Heather, of course, has done so much work to show the history of this. But I think we are at a moment where somehow these systems are breaking down, and it's being reflected by the amount of rioting that we are seeing today. So we're in a moment of kind of consciousness and crisis, but with very little that's actually being done to change the situation. And so so theoretically, I've been trying to figure out what is going on, and started to feel as if, although all of this policing continues, although we're still pushing everyone into the prison since the numbers are basically staying the same, that the model of mass incarceration is a bit of a holdover from an earlier way of governing. Large-scale warfare, war on crime, war on drugs approaches that is blocked. It's almost frozen and continues in that sense, but is being supplemented by another mode of governing, which I tried to describe in the counter-revolution, which is this more tactical, strategic use of counterinsurgency strategies and practices developed for the colonies, but that have come back to haunt us in this country. And the creation of internal enemies, Muslims and Muslim Americans, protesters, Movement for Black Life protesters, and others who have become the focus of more targeted interventions, of more hyper-militarized, some of the hyper-militarized policing that is a direct reflection of these counterinsurgency tactics or the total surveillance. And so at a theoretical level, I think that we need to try and understand both how the prison and mass incarceration is being supplemented by these other forms of surveillance and counterinsurgency policing. At the litigation level, I'd say, and here most of my litigation is in the death penalty area, but I think that what we're seeing is a real shift in the death penalty context away from a path that used to go through the federal courts and that used to go to the Supreme Court, much more towards the states at this point. I think that with the exception of some race litigation in the death penalty context, where we have been able to get the Chief Justice Roberts on board. So, for instance, in the Buck case, and I think we'll see it in the Foster case, and a few other cases where there are, these cases are so extreme in terms of the racial discrimination that is evidenced, where we still have, I think, 5 votes as a result of Roberts coming on our side on these cases. For the most part, death penalty litigation at the Supreme Court is not going to go well right now, and particularly the stay litigation, which is inevitable what happens. I'll try and go quicker. I'm sorry. The stay litigation at the 11th hour, which inevitably these cases are always at the Supreme Court. I think that the Supreme Court is now actually going to take this position that they're going to have a kind of a prejudice against giving relief. But all of that is to suggest that the movement there is from the federal government, federal courts, I think, to the states. We just saw it in California with the moratorium. We just saw it in Washington State with the Washington State Supreme Court striking down their death penalty because of racial discrimination. So I think that we're going to see that shift, and to my mind, it has implications for prison challenges because, frankly, the first step act is not. The federal interventions can just not have the kind of impact that we would want them to have because the federal population is small compared to the states. So in the same way in which the death penalty has to focus on the states, I think that would be true of the prison. And then finally, in terms of my own militancy, I would say that I've been spending a lot of my time trying to push critical theory in a different direction, in a praxis direction. My overall sentiment at this point is that kind of critical theory, critical approaches took an epistemological detour in the 20th century and focused excessively, importantly, very importantly, and I did some of this work myself, but importantly on ideology critique, on illusions, and on epistemological questions about reality, and moved away from praxis and trying to figure out what what is to be done, in part because the whole question of what is to be done often comes down as a very top-down directive, and part of where we are, I think, politically, is to much more hear what others have to say than to tell people what they should do. But the result is that we have moved away from these conversations, I think, of a reformulated question of, let me hear what you think we should be doing, and that's I think what we should be focusing on. So that's what I'm trying to focus on, at least in some of this praxis work. But it leads me to really feel that in terms of my own militancy, that on this on the question of reform versus abolition, I've really come to the conclusion that one can only take an abolitionist ethic in all of this work, that all of our work can only be guided by an abolitionist ethic, that the horizon has to be abolition, and that the important work of achieving reforms is a humanitarian need in contexts where human beings are being either placed in isolation or not being allowed to have phone calls, or, imagine, as lawyers, we're lucky because we often get to see our clients and hug our clients. But for many persons in prison, that you would have to speak to your mother or father or children through a video, right? You cannot hug your family, right? It's inhuman, right? So reforms are necessary, but it seems that they have to be kind of part of an ethic of abolition. So let me stop there.
Well, thank you, Bernard, and thank you to the other panelists. I think there are so many strands in which I could pull from, but in the spirit of thinking about praxis and abolition, one question I want to direct particularly to Heather and Vesla is the relationship between the politics of punishment and racial politics. So many have called mass incarceration, including yourselves, the civil rights struggle of our time. Black Lives Matter has been, the spark of Black Lives Matter has been fanned in no small way by police violence. The movement to deal with the sort of the excesses of punishment has produced strange coalitions, which we've heard are tenuous depending on which part of the system we want to focus on. So I just invite you guys to talk a little bit about the interrelationship between racial justice and the politics of punishment, as you understand it in our moment, and how they feed or tear at each other.
I think that's the essential question, and it's actually, this is the Achilles heel in many respects of the prison reform movement that has, as Bernard points out, really failed miserably to move the needle. And that is the inability, I think, of prison reform impulses to understand the racial roots and imperatives and the racial work that the carceral state system does, right? So this idea that if you could humanize it, which, as Bernard says, is essential. That is an ethical question that there is no six ways about it, right? That must be done. But that is a separate question from whether the actual institution could be reformed from what it is actually, what it's always trying to do, what it is in fact set up to do. So we talked earlier in your session about what is the political work that it does. Well, it isn't just that it removes people who have ostensibly committed harm against society. It actually, by doing so, escalates the political power of the people on the outside of the society. So when that's racialized, that means that to undo prisons, or to actually make prisons humane, which would mean to actually make fewer people be in prison, which would actually mean to change power relations on the outside, that is itself revolutionary because it is about upending white supremacy. So these questions are not, those are not the questions that most prison reform legislators want to touch with a 10-foot pole. They explicitly want to frame these reforms in race-neutral terms. They explicitly want, and they would argue that the only way to get any traction is to do so, right? To not call out the system for what it actually does. But it bears mention what Bernard said. And for that reason, the needle only moves for some people. So the needle will move for white addicts. The needle will move for the children of affluent communities. The needle will move for some communities over the. So it's not actually that it doesn't move. It actually does move, but it moves for only certain people. Now, the aggregate numbers don't change in any palpable way because the fundamental rationale of the system is so racialized. So it is, yes, I mean, I'll just leave it there. I mean, that is the Achilles heel of reform. It doesn't recognize that fundamental truth about the carceral state, so therefore it can't move the needle really, or for at least for the population that's most impacted.
I mean, it's a very big question, and I think it's why I actually, highlighted the work of Khalil Muhammad, because, and why I think, in the, many new tracks around the criminal justice system, his book is far and away probably, I think, one of the most important for our moment, because we have forgotten that the ideology of Black criminality was central to all manner of institutional arrangements, not just within, but also beyond the criminal justice system. So the ways in which white ethnics, their criminality became disguised and and actually channeled into pleas for greater investment, at the very same moment that Black criminality, Black offending, or just blackness, or just blackness itself, was, they were not seen as fit for citizenship, not fit for social investment, and that actually propped up all manner of public policy interventions that launched, in the words of Ira Katz-Nelson, launched a white, assimilated middle class. And so, that's one point. I think we have, I don't know, I'm in the spirit today of pointing out things that I don't think are getting enough attention. And one, I was reading Paul Butler's Chokehold, and he says something in the beginning of the book that he never comes back to, but it struck me. He said, prisons have functioned like a massive white jobs program. And that if we are to truly grapple with them, we need to grapple with the fact that white people are going to lose. They're going to lose out if we dismantle, if we draw back, if we, so that's one thing, that there are actually wages and material goods that are being given via, Blacks not being able to get jobs after prison, right? It abets and in a disguised way, white employment gains. And then the second way that I think that we need to think about or think about racial justice at the same time as we're thinking about what the system is and is constituted by. We often don't look at, we've done a lot of work in the social sciences to really map out, chart the ways in which custodial involvement, carceral involvement imperils the democratic life worlds of its wards, sets them off on parallel wage trajectories, parallel employment and family disunification and all of the like, right? But I don't think that we've grappled with what the criminal justice system teaches whites. And I had a student what it gives them, and what it conveys. So as a political scientist, I'm deeply concerned with, okay, more than just distributing benefits and distributing goods, political institutions and arrangements convey, teach Americans things about their government. They teach them whether their government sees them as citizens or not, teach them about whether they should enlist the government's help when they need it most, teach them, racially socialize them in various ways. I had a student at Yale as an undergrad who penned a very important thesis, and he looked at how the criminal justice system socializes whites, and found, interestingly enough, that whites have, middle-class whites have, not as plentiful, but many do have encounters with the criminal justice system. But their encounters teach them benevolence. They route them, they often divert them into less interaction in the future. So here we've got a system that teaches one group that the state is hierarchical, that the state can touch and abuse their bodies, that the state is not something to be enlisted when one is a victim, when one needs its help, and teaches another group the opposite lesson. I was treated fairly and kindly, and I was diverted, and the system works. And therefore, what those other people are going through is deserved. In some way, it teaches them radical legitimacy of that very system that is predating upon Black lives. And so what does that mean for political coalitions, right? What does that mean for us to be able to live and inhabit the political life worlds of Blacks who go through the system? The conclusions they arrive at are, well, if they're locked up, then they must have done something really, really bad. So, I have much more to say on racial justice and criminal justice. I am also surprised in the criminal justice space at how often this move is made by top academicians, by policy folks. Well, the system, I saw this chart the other day where somebody made the move of saying, look, even if we take all Blacks out of our prison system, we still have this, it's preposterous. We still have this amazing muscular, criminal justice largesse. And so therefore it's not about race. Michelle Alexander, I don't know what you're going on about. It's not about race. It's about neglecting the fact that the reason why we have whites incarcerated is because of the racial foundations of that system, right? Our muscular criminal justice apparatus has very racial roots that mean that whites are also exposed to high rates of criminalization. But in those same very figures, right, Black male incarceration is still off the charts compared to, the line is like way out here, and then they're using here's white male incarceration, and then here's Denmark, right? And so they're using that gap to make this claim that the US is still quite exceptional in its punishment apparatus, right? Which is really the mental gymnastics you need to do to arrive at that conclusion that it's not about race when Black male incarceration way out here, I'll end there.
So this idea of Blackness as a threat that then needs to be responded to and the material interests at stake really reminds me of Rockefeller's discussions on what to do facing rebellious inmates at Attica, as well as the argument that Bernard offers about how we now face counterinsurgency methods without actual counterinsurgents. And so maybe I would just maybe Bernard, if you want to frame this a little bit, and Heather or Vesla, if you want to jump in, about the threat that's there or the threat that is manufactured in order to justify highly repressive responses to prisoner activism or racial activism in general.
Yeah. So, I think it's important to recognize that these are manufactured threats. Now, to call them manufactured threats, though, I don't think doesn't get at the whole work that's being done here. But it's accurate, but it doesn't get at the whole the enormous amount of social ordering that's taking place. It's important to emphasize that these are manufactured threats because because the social ordering requires this imaginary of an internal enemy in order to get going. I think I think we see it well in the context of the Muslim threat in this country, or the manufacturing that President Trump has done so powerfully of a Muslim threat. I mean, during the campaign, during his administration, or the caravans, right? I mean, it's the same manufacturing of a threat. The threat of this invasion by persons coming from Latin America, and it fits. Though, so it fits. So I think it's important to emphasize that it is an illusion, that it is created in order to then get this way of governing going that has these consequences. I think, though, in relationship to what we were just talking about in terms of the racial dimension of all of this, it's also important to understand how much of an investment this is. This is how much of a political economy surrounds these ways of transforming populations into threats. And I was just thinking, for instance, of, I've been thinking and reading a lot recently about the Bronx 120 in New York, which was this large gang raid in a public housing facility in the Bronx, where they arrested 120 young men. I don't know the gender breakdown. I mean, it was predominantly young men. I don't know how many women were swept up, and of course, it was all persons of color. And but what's important there, or in the kind of stash house setups that the FBI set up in Chicago, where they basically were entrapping young guys to go after, to take over a stash house, or an alleged stash house where there was drugs, is that all of that is an incredible investment on our part. It costs a lot of money to do all of that. We're transforming individuals into persons who are then incarcerated. It requires informants. It requires paying people. It requires set up jobs. It requires, setting up the stash house, etc. It's an enormous amount of investment in order to transform someone into somebody who you then incarcerate, which itself is an enormous amount of investment. And it's a total political economy which could be used in a completely different way, right? All of that work, all of that investment could be funneled into, education or other ways to help persons rather than to punish them. And that dimension seems really important to me. But it ties, of course, to the question that what we're doing is we're creating this notion of dangerous individuals who then serve as a way to legitimate the social order that we're creating in this country.
So actually, rather than having you guys respond to that particular question, I know those in the audience are very excited to ask you guys questions, so maybe we'll move to that. So if there are those that want questions, I would only ask that you sort of say it fairly briefly, and yes, so.
So thank you guys so much. I wonder what you think of these thoughts and how they tie in. It strikes me that there are three predominant cultural influences that lead us to our moment of, a carceral state that persists, but with certain avenues in which reform has taken place. And the three influences that I see as predominant are, number one, the fact that the opioid crisis is affecting and killing rural white Americans too. So that's led to reform when it comes to our drug war. And it ties in with Derek Bell's interest convergence theory, saying that powerful white America will only do things that incidentally help Black America when white America is also hurting. So that's one influence. The other is the ubiquity of cell phones. So we see this, and cell phone video cameras. So we see this with respect to Black Lives Matter, and that may tie into Vesla's observation that, this is where conservatives fall out of the coalition, because you look at a video and different people from different cultural frameworks see different things in those videos and react to it differently. But to the extent that you see energy for, insufficient though it may be, policing reform, it's because stories are made real and they're made vibrant, they're made vivid. The third influence is DNA testing, right, and exonerations, which has brought, and this was sort of at the forefront, going back even 15 to 20 years, bringing exonerations to the forefront. Innocence, and the innocence movement had, tack on reform, it caused reform energy with respect to things like capital punishment. And I think you could even tie in there bail reform. The reason why there's coalitions building around bail reform is because we say, well, maybe people are innocent, right? So now if we take these influences as real, and I'm sure there are others, I think it's as important to ask where the shadows cast by these influences don't fall. And so this ties in with what Bernard said, what do we just not talk about? And I think one of the biggest things that we don't talk about, notwithstanding the fact that it's one of the most reprehensible facets of our carceral state, is solitary confinement, right? Because when you talk about innocence, you don't necessarily talk about solitary confinement. When you talk about cell phones and police misconduct, you don't talk about solitary confinement. When you talk about the opioid epidemic and the drug war more generally, you don't talk about solitary confinement. And it's because it's not vivid. It's because it's hidden. So I'm wondering maybe I want to shine a light on solitary confinement and say, do you see reform energy there? What would it take to generate reform energy in that space?
I'd like to respond to that, because the central thread connecting all of the things that you talked about is visibility, right? Making things visible that ordinary American voters, whoever they are, when they see them, when they see what's done in their name in the criminal justice system, if they have any decency at their core, they're appalled by it. And so I think that project of making carcerality visible is a key component of, I know what we all do, and I'm sure those of you do, and it has enormous power. And so certainly for solitary, making that visible is essential. One of the reasons why it's allowed to be as heinous as it is precisely by its nature. It is the least visible element of carceral control. So on the one hand, I just want to share that for me, that project of making carceral abuse visible, it it energizes me. It, as I know it does all of us, it makes it feel like there might be traction, even if there isn't traction. It makes us feel like we're doing something. And I think we should do that. And I think it does make a difference in real time, in real people's lives. I know that at the community level, when people see what goes on in Huron Valley Women's Prison in Ann Arbor, ordinary Ann Arbor citizens are appalled and they have been moved to act. So, and same is true in all those other instances that you mentioned. But not to put a damper on this, but I also think we have to struggle with something much, much more damning about all of this. And it goes to this heart of this question of reform versus abolition, which is if you look over the course of American history, when is carcerality employed? When is it marshaled? When is it put into the ether as the go-to public or solution to public problems? And in every single case, while it is articulated as criminality and as crime, in every case it is in response to challenges to the social and economic order. Racial primarily, but not just racial, also gender. So, for example, Scott Stern has this really fascinating book on the way in which women are criminalized for having venereal disease, whether they did or they didn't. I mean, at every moment when it's gender relations are challenged, race relations are challenged, and economic relations. So I'm also by training a labor historian. So at every moment when capital was challenged, carcerality is the go-to way of maintaining white privilege, the privilege of capital, and gender privilege, the privilege of men. So if that's true, then that means that actually carcerality is fundamental to our liberal capitalist democracy, not incidental, not coincidental, and that is so deeply disturbing. It's actually something that I'm working on in an article right now, and I struggle with this because if it's true, and I suspect it is, then it isn't just even a question of prison abolition. It's actually, you can't have anything other than this outcome we keep having again and again and again if we're going to have a liberal capitalist, largely male and white dominated state. And so the visibility, I think we should do it. We're going to do it. We must do it. It's an ethical imperative to do it. But I am deeply worried about its limitations for the reasons that I just laid out as a historian, which is damn depressing.
Yeah, I want to two-finger that and say that we have this distorted imagination of our past as not being that.
Jesus,
that,
fundamentally it is.
Among the biggest observers of American democracy, this was not lost on them.
Exactly.
And yet, somehow in our contemporary scholarship, with many exceptions noted, there tends not to be this recognition that, the slave patrol became the police, So I was looking through my phone here because just the other day I came across and this is to make the point that it's not just our own responses to pressures on to expansions of the people, always responding in carceral ways, in ways that criminalize and invoke, early law and order kinds of justifications for our response. But in the UK, the Abolition Act of 1833, which abolished slavery in most of the British Empire, an order in council is circulated in October as a model for all Crown colonies, and the Colonial Secretary Lord Stanley writes, "An effective police establishment is of the very essence of the whole measure." Yeah. There it is.
Yeah. Which is why in a prison reform context, when we say, imagine what we could do with those dollars otherwise, right? As you just said, Bernard, I imagine that all the time, and I push people to imagine it, but we won't do it because actually, if we use all those dollars otherwise, then it would completely alter power relations in this country. And the police will be that mediating, that the police are the ones that keep that as it is.
The police, who was it that, was it Eldridge Cleaver that said, when all else fails in America, they call out the police.
Right.
Right. And so, that's just a way of saying yes to everything Heather said. But I want to, and it's why my reform position or my abolitionist position is that, and from the vantage point of a political scientist, what does it mean to advance new relations between American citizens and their government? And the first part of that was recognizing that in race, class, subjugated communities, government was the police. Government was not city council, political parties. Government is the Bermuda Triangle of police, jails, the court and prisons. And so what does it mean to once you recognize that, how do we come up with a conception of state-citizen relations that dismantles that advances a new conception of what relations between citizens and their government should look like? And, on your point about the opioid crisis and, what the racial politics of how we have responded in very different ways to different crises, this is not lost on race, class, subjugated communities. They know full well that when they were enduring things in the 70s and 80s, their government did not come to their aid. It repressed them. It criminalized them. It used that same criminal system to extract enormous amounts of wealth from their communities. And I'll just read this one transcript where somebody is articulating what my colleague Tracy Mears and I call distorted responsiveness. That in these communities, what they are witnessing from government is what we theorize as distorted responsiveness. And he says, but now it moved out to the white community. He's talking about addiction. If your child is an addict, it will be no harm. Go to the nearest fire department and they will help you. Excuse me, 15 years ago, you didn't say nothing about that. In Maryland, and he names the richest counties. You have one of the richest counties, Potomac, Bethesda, Annapolis. Now it's out there and it's, oh my God, my kids are on opium. They've been stealing my stuff from the cabinet. Uh-oh, I'm one too. I've been taking it also. Now I'm addicted. Well, who's going to help you? We're going to help you. The government's going to give you money for it. Well, 15 years ago, in the black community, we came to you for money. You said it's an epidemic. We'll see what we can do. Long as it's here, it's okay, but when you get out there to your children, oh no. To your schools, oh no. And how did it get there? Those same kids came into the city. Now we go out there, we get arrested. You know that. We out of place. They come to the city, they get carte blanche. Everything gets taken care of when it hits the money community. Mm-hmm. In other words, they're theorizing the responsiveness of the state to their public health crises. And, the crisis hit Baltimore before it hit any of these rural areas.
Just one quick thought. So thanks, Josh, for kind of bringing us into the prison within the prison, right? The solitary confinement, the extremes of supermax facilities and how hidden they are. Just to connect it to the points that Vesla and Heather were making about the larger social order, or kind of the way in which we need to think about abolition in terms of the larger social order. As you were talking, and Heather, as you were introducing that idea, I was thinking of this passage from Moten and Harney's The Undercommons, right, when they talk about abolition, and they talk about not just abolishing the institutions. So here it would be kind of like not just abolishing solitary confinement or even abolishing the prison, but dismantling the society that made those institutions possible. And so that's what I heard in Heather. They write, quote, not so much the abolition of prisons, but the abolition of a society that could have prisons, that could have slavery, and therefore not abolition as the elimination of anything but abolition as the founding of a new society. So yeah, I think those tie directly to these larger issues of
Which the Republican state senators will not sign up for.
no,
And thus the Achilles heel of the prison reform moment of today.
right, yeah. Sorry.
In order to get more questions into the conversation and more voices in the conversation, maybe let's take a couple questions at once. So in the middle, and then.
Thank you. Thank you for this wonderful panel. Thank you for putting this together. I really appreciate the emphasis on taking seriously subjugated peoples as theoreticians and thinking about what would come after abolition. So I'm curious as to how the incarcerated people that you've interacted with, how they have envisioned alternative versions of justice. What do those look like? I thought it was very fascinating, Dr. Thompson, when you said that many people are just asking for basic humanity, which is often in the form of reforms, whereas abolitionists are kind of very skeptical of reforms. Mm-hmm. So taking them seriously, what does that look like? And then also quickly for Dr. Weaver, you talked about creating or kind of intervening in the relationship between the state and Black and brown children, intervening before their first encounter with the state as the police. What would that look like? Mm-hmm. I'll stop there.
Mm-hmm. Are you going to see more?
Oh, thanks.
Hey guys, thank you for this panel. It's been really great. I'm really interested in reparations, and I want to see if I could bring that to bear on this discussion on prison reform. So what do you guys think is owed to victims of the drug war, specifically individuals convicted of drug offenses living in states where that drug has been legalized? And another related question would be, when talking about compensation, how should these individuals, these victims of the drug war, be distinguished from individuals wrongly convicted of a crime? And how should that distinction inform different compensation plans for these two groups?
Thank you. So it seems like there are a lot of similarities between sort of the prison abolition movement and also the modern anti-sexual assault movement, sort of in their grassroots nature, sort of the level of attention they receive in academia, and also the political leanings of the people that they attract. They also seem sort of diametrically opposed in that one argues that the state shouldn't sit in judgment of its citizens and be in the business of confining them, and the other one sort of laments the fact that it frequently fails to do just that, at least with respect to sexual assault. So my question is, one, have I mischaracterized either of these? And if I have, please correct me. But if I haven't, how should these two movements interact ideally?
Boy, great question. You want us to take some of those now? Or?
Yeah, you guys should.
I guess I'll start just really quickly. To your question about what do people imagine, I obviously this is a complicated question. It depends who the people are, but I will tell you that in myriad recent events I've been convenings that I've attended, where there have been prison abolitionists, so defined, and then there have been impacted communities, and everybody's on the same panel or in the same room discussing it, and there are huge tensions. And so what do people want? How do they articulate it? I mean, to simplify it or to characterize everybody as one person, which is difficult to do, they want to access the state again. They want to be treated, they want the same resources that the state offers other communities, rather than having the state resources always be offered them in a punitive fashion. So rather than overthrow the state, I hear time and again, no, we need free college, we need better public schools, we need better public health, we need access to drug treatment. In other words, the state needs to become more responsive. And that, rather than the state itself is the problem, there's almost that the police are the problem and prisons are the problem, but the state itself, the failing of the state is to not give its resources equitably. So a solution would be, let's have the state distribute those resources equitably. And, it's hard to know what to think about that, because you're talking about people who have absolutely been robbed of all those resources of the state. And so that's an absolutely logical conclusion to draw. You look at communities that have benefited from myriad state resources, and it's a logical thing to say, well, God, our lives would be so much better if we merely had access to the same resources, the state resources everyone else has. So I don't, how that circles the square with abolition. It's hard sometimes, because abolitionists are saying, no, the state is the origin of the oppression. And I'm going to leave the reparations question because I'm talking too much, and I know that you have other things to say about that. But on the question of the essentially the Me Too movement versus in prison abolition, I don't know the answer about how to circle that square either, but I can tell you that it's a very slippery slope, at least the way it's worked itself out on my campus. Rather than deal with questions of gender and patriarchy and oppression and sexual violence, what's happened is we are doubling down on felony disclosure policies on my campus. we're having police visit all of our department meetings to talk about the importance of reporting to the police. We are militarizing our campus, and we are doing it in the name of a fight of sexual taking on sexual assaults. So that's a major, major problem right now. But it shouldn't surprise us, because historically we know that that's exactly what happened after the feminist movement calling attention to domestic violence, and again, that being taken up as a charge to further criminalize rather than think about rather than thinking about the origin story, which is a question about patriarchy and violence, not a question about criminalization. So I'll leave it there.
Well, I'm writing a whole book on how people who have grown up in communities where surveillance by the police is regular and routine and is a key moment, a key defining moment of civic worth and democratic learning. And so I won't be able to say everything that they say, but I do think it's interesting as a political scientist. I went into this work thinking, okay, all of the things that animate our scholarly corpus should be found in these dialogues, right? People should recourse to themes of greater representation, greater political inclusion, more votes, more access to the halls of power, more people that look like them in authority positions. And I was struck, because that is neither lexically present in these dialogues, nor is it something like an anchor that's hanging over the whole conversations. And we find several things. So what, if not that, right? If not a representational relationship, what then? They want to be known by the state. Mm-hmm. They want recognition, not necessarily representation, recognition. When you come into my neighborhood, chop it up with me. Know who I am in my full self. Don't reduce me to what you've seen on a stereotypical media, portrayal. They want to be regarded in the way that they see themselves and their communities. They want to be seen as communities that do a lot of other things besides, so I'm actually pretending like I'm a political theorist and diving into the recognition literature. they also, I mean, I think it's so interesting in political science how often we talk about like we need a greater connection to government, right? So when people's preferences aren't don't become policy outcomes, that's a recipe for oligarchy, a government skewed to the rich, and that's the kind of like chorus in our field. No, they don't want a tighter connection to government. In fact, we see a lot of community control discourses. We want control over our institutions. We don't just want a few more black cops on the force. We want to be able to say, what that force does in our communities. And then on your question about what would revisioning, youth contact, I recently wrote a policy brief about this that will be coming out soon. And what I wrote is undermining police contact with youth is a backstop. We spend the first part of the article saying we need a radical reduction in police youth contact. We need a new norm that it is inappropriate, and you can actually look to deinstitutionalization of youth as a model. This nation shuttered youth prisons. We cut them by half. Everything you say about incarceration rates not declining is not true of youth incarceration. It happened with little fanfare. You probably don't know it happened. Every single state started to close their youth prisons. They did this based on the logic that adolescence is a different developmental stage and that adolescents aren't fully capable. They're more, they're more likely to engage in risky behavior. They're more, prone to peer influence. And we have all these kind of safeguards within the criminal justice system in how to deal with youth. They have far more protections, as you well know. We have none of those protections when it comes to policing. If police want to approach my child, they can approach them in the same exact way they would approach a 35-year-old. I think there is huge opportunity to intervene there. But that's just the first step. Prevent youth contact in the first place and the second is to promote attachment to institutions, reinforcing citizenship and civic health. We now know that youth of color live in what's called civic deserts, where they have few opportunities to get engaged in political life and civic life. Community centers have been on the decline. There are few public spaces, and one of my favorite books of late is by Eric Kleinenberg, Palaces for the People, which is all about how, he has a really interesting finding. He looks at the Chicago heat wave and basically finds that the same neighborhoods had radically different morbidity rates. And the one kind of pivotal factor was the presence of social and civic infrastructure. Why not reroute some of those resources that are going towards surveillance of youth, towards attachment with pro-civic, citizenship-enhancing government contacts? Why is a 13-year-old's first experience of an authority through a surveillant kind of logic? They have many, and so anyway, we draw on a few what we think of as promising initial examples, but I'll be honest with you, there's not many that have really tried to go that next step of saying, okay, once we reduce this and get rid of surveillant logics vis-a-vis youth, what do we replace it with? What do we put in its stead? I'm a big fan of youth councils, youth-led, even youth religious organizations, right, are a powerful way of youth activating and becoming democratic agents long before they can vote and being given lessons that, their voice matters in political life and they have a lot to say. All the youthful movements, We Charge Genocide, Black Lives Matter chapters, Million Hoodies for Justice, I'm waiting for the empirical study to come out on this. They took youth who were, the Let Us Breathe collective in Chicago, they took youth who were poised to become disaffected and alienated because of all these adversarial contacts with government, and instead made custodial relations the pivot point for their activation as democratic citizens and as knowledgeable, sophisticated, powerful actors who could do the work of reimagining what a new society that has different relations between state and citizen would look like. And I would love to see, like, what were the effects for, like, long-term civic engagement? Anyway, yeah. And I am sorry that I'm punting on your I'm hoping Bernard will answer it.
Yeah, okay, let me get to that one. And just to follow up, the other place where we saw radical transformation, of course, is deinstitutionalization of mental hospitals. And that entire experience, unfortunately, provides us with a lot of failures that we can learn from. But it's another place where I think that we can explore as a way to think about what happens when there is abolition, because in fact we really did abolish a structure that was the size of practically the size of mass incarceration today when we did that in the 1960s. All right, very quickly then, I'm just going to give reading suggestions because other people have thought about this more. In terms of the relationship between abolition and sexual assault, I would recommend Allegra McLeod's article, Prison Abolition and Grounded Justice, where she deals explicitly with the question of rape and sexual assault and how to think about it. It's in the ACLU Law Review, 2015. She does a really good job there of talking about the fact that there really isn't necessarily a reason why we think of sexual assault and rape punishment as being usefully accounted for through incarceration and prison processes. She also has a chapter coming out in a book I'm editing with Didier Fassin called A Time for Critique. She has a chapter in there on law and critique in which she explores the incident, the charge of sexual assault within the Black Youth Project 100 organization, which they decided to deal with it internally rather than go to the police or use the carceral system. And so they kind of put in place their own way of resolving that. She writes about it at length in that chapter, and that is another way, a useful way to think about it, I think. In terms of reparations, my colleague, Catherine Franke, has just published a book which might be helpful on this called Repair, Redeeming the Promise of Abolition, which it's either out today or very shortly, but my phone is not helping me with data. I think there might be some helpful ways of thinking about reparations there. I mean, the question that you raise is particularly interesting as to whether or not there should be a separate logic of reparation in the case of what is effectively kind of retroactive unconstitutionality in a way, right? We're abolishing crimes in a sense. We're saying that something that was criminalized should not have been a crime. It's now a fully lawful act. And, in law, there are different standards that apply to those issues, those questions of retroactivity. Different rules often apply when you're dealing with something that shouldn't have been a crime in the first place. And we've recognized that now. It's hard though there's an extra hook there, I think. But that hook seems to me just as compelling, for instance, with transformation of crack sentencing, for instance, right? From the 100-to-1 to the 18-to-1 ratios. I mean, there too, it's not like you've decriminalized something, but you've had some social recognition much too late after so much damage and not sufficiently that the 100 to 1 crack to powder cocaine disparities should never have existed. And then, and so we're kind of like slicing here to the ordinary case, or that doesn't have that hook, but that seems equally compelling to me, that someone's life has been ruined. The Bronx 120 has been ruined because the approach was to criminalize, use RICO conspiracy charges as a way to deal with social ordering, basically. So on the one hand, I think that there's both an attraction and a danger to a distinguishing of, say, marijuana convictions, because it's the same double-edged sword that we have with innocence in the death penalty or in the criminal justice arena, Because when you focus on innocence, then it has this kind of negative impact on all of my other clients who aren't innocent, but who deserve the same treatment. You know what I mean? But
Can I also add to that, this question about reparations, because it was making me think about, so this is not answering your question about what should we do, but I want to talk about the reason implicit in your question is that we know that even though things that were illegal are now not illegal, that those people who are still in prison, so think about how in Colorado, for example, why is there not an immediate move to let them out, right?
Yeah.
So let's forget about like what we're going to do when we do let them out, just for the sake of this moment. So we don't immediately let them out. And similarly, after Miller versus Alabama, you've got all of these children that we have now decided have the opportunity for parole. It is unconstitutional to deny them a chance at parole. So why don't we immediately resentence all of these kids? That goes to the heart of what I was saying earlier, which is that it forces us to look at what the carceral state is really about. If you believe that it's about crimes and if you believe it's about wrongdoing and crime, then those moments, all you can do is shake your head and say, it's just logical. If marijuana is no longer a crime, why aren't we letting these people out? If you understand the carceral state to be about racial order and about class privilege, then it is absolutely logical that marijuana becomes legal, but you will do everything in your power to keep black dudes in prison. Or in Detroit, where we have almost 400 children serving life sentences, overwhelmingly children of color, it makes sense why we don't automatically resentence them. The prosecutors are doing everything in their power to keep those black and brown children in prison for life. So it is it's this underside of reform where the thing about a successful reform, which we welcome, and believe me, I've been at plenty of these hearings where juvenile lifers get resentenced, and it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, and it's amazing. So I don't want to underestimate it, but it lays bare what this is really about. It lays bare what the limitations are. And so I still am going to support everything that would allow me to take a child who served 49 years and let them come home, because they're now not even a child anymore. But damn, when you look at those cases, you can't even imagine for half a second this is about crime. That this is about racial order and about class order. And that then means that we're only going to be able to do so much, but we should do it.
I can't think of a better way to end the conversation. And I'll echo Bernard's call to all increase our reading lists. And among those things that you should, of course, read are their books. Most recently, The Counter-Revolution, Blood in the Water, and Vesla Weavers have a bunch, but Arresting Citizenship being among a host that you should check out. And so with that, would you join me in thanking our panelists?
Thank you.